Hello and welcome to my Sunday video. I am going to go ahead and start even though S'mores is sort of attacking me for attention right now. Hello and welcome to Grumpy Sunday Chat. Why is it Grumpy Sunday Chat? Because of daylight savings time. At this time of year, we get those articles telling us we're going to die because of daylight savings time. We're going to have heart attacks. We're going to be infertile. We're probably going to get in traffic accidents, all of the works. It's all going to happen because our government forces us to get up an hour early for 8 months out of the year. Yes. And why does our government do this? I don't think anybody knows anymore. I think it has something to do with commerce. That's what most people would guess. You know, you always follow the money. And that's usually where it's at. So like Wall Street wants to keep daylight savings time because people tend to buy things when it's sunlight out after when there's more sun out when they get off work. I don't know what the reality is of why our government tries to force us to do this. We could go on a massive rebellion. We could have a massive rebellion in which we only honor the type of analog and digital clocks that do not change automatically, like our phones and our computers, but trying to get people to actually get on board a rebellious movement is probably nearly impossible because hurting people is like hurting cats. It's very difficult to do, and unless they have a huge stake in it, like when everybody threw the tea in the harbor because they were being taxed and they didn't want to spend money, like, yeah, a lot of times that's what it comes down to, is money for a lot of people. Then you're not really going to get people on board, and you have those crazy lunatics who actually want to have more sunlight after they get off work, so they're in favor of daylight savings time. But I would like to encourage those people to just get up an hour earlier, go to work an hour earlier, find a job where they can go out and go to work an hour earlier, and just leave the rest of us alone. But even if we convinced those people to do that, we still would not convince the government. I don't know who those articles are even written for. Like, government officials don't care. They don't care about our health. Like, if they did, they would have gotten rid of daylight savings time ages ago, but they haven't. And so I don't know. I don't know what to say. It just makes me super grumpy, and because I lose sleep, and you can actually see how tired I look here. And I also worked a lot yesterday. That might also be why I'm tired, but I'm also tired because my sleep got messed up. What little sleep I got was messed up from the having to get up an hour earlier to go to mass. So basically, instead of having to be to choir practice at 8:30, I had to be there at 7:30 in the morning. And yeah, so anything that, yeah, of course I can get up that early. Anybody can force themselves to get up earlier, but when you force your body to make a fundamental change from its normal routine, it can be devastating to your health, to your circadian rhythms, and having extra light in the afternoon, in the morning. See, that's what I hate about daylight savings time. Such a lie. Like, just when it starts getting bright, I get up at 6 a.m. or thereabouts, pretty much almost 7 days in the week. Although on Saturdays I try to go back to bed for a little bit, you know, just with the idea that I'm going to sleep in a little bit more. But I mean, that almost never happens. At this time of year, this is when it starts getting light at 6 a.m. and it makes me happy, and it like fires my brain, and I get happy and I'm not grumpy. But now that's been just taken from me. So all these daylight savings, what are they doing? They just took my daylight. So I'm not going to get up at a different hour. I'm not going to get up, you know, I have things to do. I have to do my normal routine. I have to do my workout in the morning and all of that. And yeah, I guess I could work out after I get off work, but I'm usually too dang tired to do that. So that's probably not likely to happen. I go for a walk because it's relaxing, but my workout is done before I go to work, when I ostensibly have energy, and it's so nice when there's sunlight streaming through the windows, but that's been robbed from me. So thank you, daylight savings time people who just stole my daylight. you know, like that song, "Steal my sunshine, you stole my sunshine, and I don't like you anymore." And that's why I'm grumpy, because I don't like people who steal my sunshine. Yeah, that's Grumpy Jill for you. Now, because I'm grumpy, I want to do something that is a little bit different from my airhead rants, because, you know, I do want to be an airhead. This is my life goal, is to not be this boring, stoic intellectual and instead be an airhead. And the ironic thing is I was watching my the video I made where with my interview. There's only a short clip of me at the beginning, and otherwise it's focused on my interviewee. But I noticed that, probably because I'm in direct sunlight, and I noticed how drab my hair looked, so I dyed my hair blonde. And you probably can't really see it in this lighting. I had to try to dye it dark blonde, because I'm never going to bleach my hair to dye it any color. And so it is what it is. It's probably mostly the same red color it was before, but I tried to dye it dark blonde just to make it look a little brighter, dark bright, you know. I thought it would help. Anyway, I don't know if it has, but it's kind of ironic because I was going to not be an airhead today. And the other irony about hair color is that years and years ago, like 20 years ago, I did all this research to see if there was any correlation between hair color and IQ. And I was writing it for a paper, and I don't even remember what for, but yeah, it was a long time ago. So if it was 20 years ago, it was probably when I was first starting school, so who knows, you know, what class it was for or why I was doing it. I don't even remember what the paper was about. But I did all this research, and in a broad, sweeping research of people all over the world who had put in their physical characteristics and taken IQ tests, the top IQ testers were bald men. So that didn't help at all, because you don't even know what their hair color is. If they mark themselves as bald, they're not, you know, they're not stating whether they're blonde or whatever, they don't have any hair. And also, that stereotype is usually directed at women. So yeah, okay, bald men are the highest IQ testers, according to that study. Who knows what can shift and change through time, but in that study. And I had read another study that was testing only women. They were military wives on a military base, and those were the women that they used for their study. Maybe that meant that at the time that they were mostly one ethnic group or not. I don't know. I really don't. But they really found no correlation between hair color and IQ. Most women, so say you have a scatter plot, most women are going to be in these dots in this like little cloud here surrounding the averages. There was, however, one anomaly, and that was this little cloud of dots over here in the very, very high Q area. That would be the genius IQ, and those were actually associated with blonde women. So although most blonde women still cluster around the averages, there is this anomaly of blonde women actually in this test, testing higher than average IQ. Now, dyeing my hair blonde does not give me an above average IQ. So that's it. And in the immortal words of Stephen Fry, I may be stupid, but I'm not clever. And with that, what I was going to talk about today, in my grumpy state, which I am not normally against Protestants or any of that. I am Catholic, but I'm not really specifically against Protestants, except there are some really strange Protestant ideas out there. And one of them is the KJV only. The reason why it is peculiar to me is that, see, I'm going to use a good vocabulary. I am going to, let's see, peculiar, weird, strange, unusual, unnatural. I don't know. I'm trying to think of synonyms for peculiar. Unique. That's not quite what I'm reaching for. Peculiar is more of what I'm reaching for here in my, because like I said, because I'm not being an IQ, that means I have to tap into my my colossally behemoth vocabulary. There you go. In order to present this information to you that I'm about to present. Yes. So this is going to be considered peculiar things about Protestants. And one of them is the KJV only. Did I already say that? I don't know. Because I really am an airhead. I don't remember what I say from one moment to the next. The reason why it is weird, yes, weird, is that the type of Christians who are KJV only are generally the type who are just as anti-Anglican as they are anti-Catholic, because in their Protestantism, they were rebelling against the King of England and his Anglican church. And isn't that ironic that they cling to the English Bible that was produced by the Anglican Church? Yes, I find that funny. However, I have a theory as to why they prefer the King James. And now, like I said, I'm not anti-Protestant, and I'm not trying to be abusive towards Protestants. Maybe I don't understand. Maybe I don't understand why there are Protestants who are KJV only, despite the fact that they are generally anti-Anglican. Why is that? Okay, I'm just going to present a theory to you, and that theory is that concurrent with the writing of the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible was published in 1611, but concurrently, the Catholic Church was also coming up with an English translation of the Bible. It's called the Douay-Rheims. The Douay-Rheims actually beat the King James Bible in their publishing. I believe the New Testament was published in 1582, and the Old Testament was finished. They had finished the translating of it and publishing. They published it by like 1610. So they beat the King James by not much, just a little bit. But obviously, they were obviously being translated concurrently. So that may be why Protestants are into the KJV, because it is, when it comes to Protestantism, being anti-Catholic is primary, because, you know, that is what they were protesting. They were protesting the Catholic Church. And even though they also protested the Anglican Church, the Anglicans just being a rebellious sect of Catholicism, really, when it comes down to it, they're still, the Anglicans are still Protestants. And so if you're going to align yourself with one side or the other, you're going to choose the King James version of the Bible instead of the Douay-Rheims. And now back then, when the King James Bible was published, it had what the Protestants call the Apocrypha, the Catholics call the Deuterocanon. And so they had the same books in the Bible at that time. Now, of course, most Protestant Bibles have gotten rid of what they call the Apocrypha, but that didn't happen until like the mid-19th century. So all of these books that the Catholics have in their Bibles that the Protestants eventually just nixed from theirs, they were present in Protestant Bibles all the way up to like the mid-19th century. And so for most of church history, the books were the same in the Bible. Yeah. So anyway, that's just an interesting point. So it isn't even that the King James Bible that was published in 1611 had a different set of books than the Catholic Bible. It was simply the Protestant translation that came out about the same time that the Catholic translation came out in English. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I thought that the Catholic Church wanted to prevent the Bible from being in the hands of the common people. That is one of those sigh-worthy, I don't even know how to respond to that statement, because it is such a fundamental misunderstanding of history. It is as if Protestants believe that since the time of Christ, people were generally literate, could read, they could go to a bookstore, they could go to a library, and they could buy a book, they could borrow a book, and that books were just plentiful everywhere. And the Catholic Church just didn't want the average people to have access to Bibles, and so they stole all the Bibles so that nobody could have them, and they chained them up, and they wouldn't translate them into the language of the individual country. And that is so fundamentally false. It's just ridiculous. Like, do you even history? Like, that's not even a verb, but I'm going to use it as if it were a verb. Do you even do history, bro? I mean, do you? Because that is ridiculous, and I'm not even a historian, and I know that's ridiculous. I like history back in the days when I was pretending to be an intellectual stoic instead of the airhead that I prefer to be. I do like history, but I'm in no ways a historian. But I mean, honestly, I don't think you can be honest with yourself as a human being and look back into history and believe that people were literate and had access to books before the Gutenberg printing press. The Gutenberg printing press, which was invented in like the mid 15th century, I'm gonna say like maybe around 1440s. Okay, so mid 15th century, the Gutenberg printing press was invented and came to the market, was brought to the marketplace, and it completely transformed the world. It was probably the number one single part of history, I mean, aside from Jesus himself, who changed the course of history, that changed the course of history. And you might think it's the internet, but it's really not. The Gutenberg printing press changed everything. Now let's think about the way the world was before that. Now let's go back through there. I don't use the term dark ages, but let's go through those times that people like to consider the dark ages and back to the earliest days of the Christian church, when the Roman Empire was still the biggest empire on earth. Okay? What was the language spoken by the common people? It was the Latin Vulgate. What were the original Bibles? What were they originally published in? The Latin Vulgate. So the Catholic Church was trying to ensure that the vast majority of people would understand God's word. That's why the Bible was translated into the Latin Vulgate. That is, Vulgate coming from the word vulgar, which means common. That was the common tongue of the people. The cultured tongue of the people at the time was Greek, and the Catholic Church fought to have the Bible in the common language of the most people, because we're talking about an empire that expanded over nations. And when you have a difficulty in publishing, and when you have difficulty in literacy, because it took hours upon hours and upon hours to handwrite entire Bibles. I mean, Bibles are a compilation of numerous books, and we're talking like 1,000 pages, right? So this takes time. And so books were extremely costly. They were very valuable. That is also why they were chained up, so that they wouldn't be stolen and sold on the black market. Okay, the Catholic Church invested their time and effort into preserving the Word of God, and they preserved it under the Roman Empire in the language that was spoken by the common people. Okay? Now, before the Gutenberg printing press, yes, there were other translations of the Bible that had been done, but it was difficult. It took your actually educated scholars to translate the Bible into other languages. And of course, in addition to the fact that they had to be translated, the Bible had to be translated into other languages, it had to be handwritten at the same time. So, at the collapse of the Roman Empire, what happened? Well, a lot of chaos, because the Roman Empire was brought culture and structure, and it brought education. And people who were educated under the Roman Empire were generally educated by the Catholic Church, okay? And people who knew how to read and write knew how to read and write in Latin. That again is why the Bible was translated into Latin for so long, because it was the common language. People who were taught to read were still taught to read in Latin, and so they could read Latin. And you know those things that you all Protestants consider to be idols, like iconography in churches? Well, that was a way to present the gospel. These images were a way to present the gospel to a largely illiterate population. And not only was the population of the world, most of it, illiterate up until the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. Now, it didn't happen overnight, but I'm going to get there in a second. But most people would have considered it just a waste of time, because they were trying to feed their families. And so they had work to do. They had to get up at the crack of dawn and go work on their farms or whatever it was that they did for a living, so that they could feed their family. And that generally did not involve reading or writing. And it just wasn't part of what they did. Or even considered important. You know, does this feed my family? No. Well, then I'm not interested. And also, it wasn't like they could just go buy a book. So if they did learn to read and write, what would they do with it? Like, yeah, I guess they could read a contract and sign their name to a contract. I guess that would be helpful to a lot of people. But as far as like going and buying the latest, greatest adventure novel, your average person could not do that. They couldn't. This is why people used to memorize scripture. They used to memorize books. They memorized mythology. Mythology stories were written as poetry, so that it was easier to memorize. And that actually is why we have a lot of epic tales that are written as poetry. It dates back to the days when the memorization of texts was all you had, because these stories were passed on orally. And how do you remember something? Well, you remember it when it has various poetic tropes, and that made it easier. Anyway, so yeah, and they would go to the theater. Poor people would go to the theater because they could probably afford that, but that didn't require reading and writing. It required the actors presenting a story on stage. That was how people got their entertainment. That's how they got stories. That's how myths were passed along and all of that. Okay, so now we get to let's pause a little bit in the Dark Ages. When you had all this chaos going on, well, what happened? You had the Catholic Church still preserving the Word of God, even though there was so much destruction and so much chaos that happened at the end of the Roman Empire. That's, by the way, why it's called the Dark Ages, even though a lot of historians do not prefer that term, because there was really a lot of culture and rebuilding that happened during that time. And again, like I said, a lot of it was owing to the Catholic Church and the preservation of the scripture and of literacy. So it took a lagging time where you had a lot of really uneducated priests and monks because of the structures that were just, they fell apart. I mean, it just happens. But there were elements of the Catholic Church that they preserved that, and they kept it going. And so fast forward to the time of the invention of the printing press. Well, guess what was first printed on the printing press? That would be the Latin Vulgate Bible, because still to that day, people who were educated were still taught to read and write in Latin. And so it was still the most practical version of the Bible, because the most people could read it. Okay? Do you understand that? Latin Vulgate. Common. Vulgate means common. It used to be the common language of the Roman Empire. It was still the common language that people learned to read and write in. And so when Johannes Gutenberg created his printing press. One of the first, well, I think it was the first full-length book that he printed was the Latin Vulgate. It was called the 42-line Bible, I think is what it was called, because he could print 42 lines per page on there, and that of course saved paper, because paper would have been more expensive at that time, because they didn't, you know, they weren't, just because we had a printing press didn't mean that we were mass producing paper, and so paper itself would have been kind of expensive. So anyway, so you have the invention of the printing press, and the first book, full-length book that was published on it was the Latin Vulgate Bible. And then what happens after that? What happens in that time period after the printing press was invented? Well, look at the way the world changed. So you have the ability to now make books more affordable to more people. So maybe to the poorest people, no, perhaps not. But the books just became much more affordable. And so the average people could purchase them or borrow them. I mean, there would just have been more books that became more and more widely available. So what happens when you have literature that is more widely available, you have people who are going to become more educated and more literate. So as we're going forward through time, you know, the Catholic Church is translating into other languages, because now they have the ability to publish Bibles much more easily, much more quickly, and so this is helpful. Okay, so they're on this path to translate the Bible into other languages, and of course so are the Protestants, because the Protestant Reformation happened, you know, soon after the printing press as well. So you have the Protestants who are also doing this, and by the time you get to about 1800, you have the same level of literacy that we have today, probably even greater, because the kinds of works that people read and comprehended at that time were much more complex than what we read now. Like their sentence structure and their thought processes from beginning to end are just much more complex. We've simplified a lot over since about 1800. We've simplified so much, and our vocabulary is, well, it's changed. I don't know if it's smaller or bigger. Probably smaller. I don't know. People were just better educated back then, and I don't think that I'm whitewashing history and looking back and saying, oh, history was better than it is now. I mean, you can literally go read what people were reading at that time, and you can see for yourself that it's much more complex than what we read now. And you know, a lot of people say they can't understand the King James Bible. Well, the King James Bible is written at about a 6th grade reading level, and I understand that some of the language just doesn't translate because we don't use it anymore, but it really in general is very readable. Like, just skip the these and thous. And most people can figure that out on their own, and it's really not very complicated. I don't understand why the King James Bible gets this like, oh, I can't understand it. Well, it's at a 6th grade reading level, so what does that say about your literacy? I don't know. Yeah, of course we don't. You know, a lot of the language, we just don't use those words anymore. So yeah, I guess you could make a case for that we have a different set of vocabulary, and so if we modernize Bibles, then we have a more modern set of vocabulary that we understand. And I don't know, I guess that's one thing that the King James only people are fighting against, that modern vocabulary, because if you're importing modern vocabulary, you're probably importing modern ideas too. But that is not really any different from the King James Bible. I mean, they would have been importing their ideas, their Protestant ideas, into the Bible. Whatever that means, I don't know. Anyway, that is the basic of what I wanted to talk about. I don't really have much else to say. I just want people to grasp history. Sometimes people get the weirdest ideas about history in their head. Like, the Catholic Church just wanted to prevent people from reading the Bible. Well, actually, I think the reason why that is so popular to say is that the Catholic Church really did not approve of the Bible just being translated without their approval. They didn't approve of something that they didn't approve of. Nice going for the not airhead speech, Jill. It's not really working for you. Okay, yeah, they didn't approve of translations that were outside their authority. And if the translations were done in such a way that they didn't support the Trinity or other established concepts in established dogma in the church, then yeah, no, they would not want that Bible to be printed. And so they were pretty harsh in coming down on people who they felt were mistranslating the Bible. But it wasn't that they were trying to keep the Bible from people. It was because they wanted their versions to be the ones that were widely available to people. And that is, of course, why they began, an effort in translating the Bible. And like I said, they actually beat the King James and their Dewey Reams and having a Bible translated in English. And there hadn't been a Bible translated in English for many centuries. And so it was definitely needed at that time. And I honor both sides for wanting to translate and bring the Bible into what would have been considered, modern day English. And the King James Bible ended up being actually more modern. I think they used a lot more Latin-based words in the Dewey Reams, and that ended up, being retranslated into more modern English later, in like the 18th century, for that reason, because it just wasn't as modern as the King James. But the idea was to have a modern, approved version of the English Bible, and that's why the Catholic Church was, translating it. I don't know if this will convince people who are anti-Catholic. I don't know that I will convince you of anything. You might just have it in your head that the Catholic Church really just never wanted the average person to have access to the Bible. But I don't know that if you're any sort of respected historian at all, if you could possibly even, I don't think historians would agree with that. That's just not the way history panned out. I suppose if you are a Protestant, then you have a vested interest in putting your side of history forward, and I guess you have that right as well. But I'm just trying to correct a few things. There was a time when I really didn't have that much invested interest in giving apologetics for the Catholic Church, but I still understood this as being historically true, that before the printing press, it was just really, really difficult to get Bibles into the hands of common people. It was just very difficult. And I think I started talking about iconography and presenting the gospel that way through images that illiterate people could grasp. And I think about that when I do the Stations of the Cross, because that's literally what the Stations of the Cross is presenting the story of Jesus going to the cross and rising again. That is what it depicts. It depicts the very fundamental faith in Christianity. Anyway, yes, it's not, those Stations of the Cross are not meant to be worshiped. They're meant to tell the story of Christ's journey to the cross, his death, and his resurrection. That's what it's meant to show. And of course, now I think we are so far removed from an illiterate world that we don't understand this. We think, well, it must be idolatry. No, it's really not. And as far as it goes, I think that God created a beautiful world, and I think it is an impulse within humanity to create beautiful items, and sometimes they end up worshiping the beautiful items they themselves created. But creating a beautiful object that demonstrates the life of Christ does not an idol make. And I think I'm going to end this video here, because if I keep going, I don't know, grumpy, tired Jill's just going to take over, and we don't want that to happen. So goodbye.